Hello and welcome. My name is Sid Morris, and today we'll be talking about genetics in biology. It's just an introduction of the topic, but I hope what I'm going to explain is going to help you. So let's start together this topic. So, what is genetics? Genetics is defined as the scientific study of inheritance of characteristics from parents to offsprings. It is the scientific study of inheritance of characteristics from parents to offsprings. So when we're studying genetics, we're just dealing with the passing of traits from parents to offsprings. Offsprings are children. Okay, so it is very evident that when you look at some children, you see that they have characteristics similar to those found in their parents. Maybe, for example, the parent is tall and the child is also tall. So, thus inheritance, passing of traits from parents to offsprings. Offsprings. The other name for offsprings is progeny, and or you may just say kids, children. So that's it about the definition of genetics, the scientific study of inheritance of characteristics from parents to offsprings. So we should talk about genes, the meaning of genes. Every characteristic in an individual, is caused by what we call genes. So in the nucleus of the cell of every living organism, there are things that we call genes. These genes are the ones responsible for any characteristic that a person might show. For example, you have genes for height, you have genes for maybe the skin color, you have genes for the eye color. So the genes are the ones which determine characteristics in an individual. But there are different forms of the same gene. You have different forms of the same gene. So the different forms of the same gene is what we call an array. An array, others pronounce it as array, others pronounce it as allele, but that's the issue. So an allele means different forms of the same gene. Remember, genes are chemical factors which determine characteristics in individuals. So we are saying those genes, they have there are some versions, there are some forms of those genes, and those forms are what we call arrays. This means to say, if we have maybe if we can look at the gene for maybe the gene for eye color, the gene for height. In the gene for height, if a person has a gene for height, it can either be that the person is tall or the person is short. So the tall or the short, these are arrays of the same gene, and the gene is the gene for height. That's what we call an array. But there are two different types of arrays. You have two different types of arrays. There is a dominant array and a recessive array. So what is a dominant array and what is a recessive array? A dominant array is the array that influences a characteristic to develop in an individual over another array. A dominant array is the array that has power over the other arrays. So if a person has two arrays, and each of these arrays are determining a certain characteristic in the person will only show the characteristics that are determined by the dominant array. And this dominant array is represented by a capital letter. When we are drawing these things, when we are representing these things in biology, we use letters. So a dominant array is represented by a capital letter, whereas a recessive array is the array that cannot influence the development of a certain characteristic in an individual in the presence of a dominant array. This means to say, if we are to add a dominant array and a recessive array, if we have a dominant array and a recessive array, for example, maybe the dominant array is for tallness and the recessive array is for shortness. If you have these two in a person, the person will only show the characteristics of a dominant array, and in this case, the person will be tall. It doesn't matter that there is a recessive array inside there for shortness, but if you have a recessive array and a dominant array, the person only shows the characteristics that are being determined by the dominant array. And I've said the dominant array is represented by a capital letter, whereas a recessive array is represented by a small letter. So when these arrays, remember we've said arrays are these are different forms of the same gene, and we've said there are two types of arrays, dominant and recessive. So when these arrays are combined together, they form a pair. When these arrays they don't exist independently, but they exist as a pair. So a pair of arrays which is determining a given characteristic in an individual is what we call a genotype. So a genotype is a pair of arrays, and the other name for a genotype is genetic composition. So the genotype of an individual is always represented by letters. The genotype of a person is an organism is always represented by letters, and these letters appear in pairs. We've said that these letters appear in pairs, but each of the components of that pair is an array. So there are also two types of genotypes. We have a homozygous genotype and a heterozygous genotype. So a homozygous genotype, this is a genotype that is only made up of the same arrays. It is made up of the exact same arrays. For example, we may have capital B and capital B, or we may have small letter b and small letter b. Remember, small letter for recessive and capital letter for dominant. So capital B and capital B, these are exactly the same. Therefore, this is what we call a homozygous genotype. A homozygous genotype is the genotype in which all the arrays are the same. And in this case, because all these, they are B's and they are all dominant arrays, this is called a homozygous dominant genotype. This is a homozygous dominant genotype. A homozygous dominant genotype is a genotype that is made up of two exact arrays. And then you have in the other example I said, if you have a small letter b and a small letter b, that is it is also homozygous because the arrays are the same. You have small letter b and small letter b, these are the same. But because small letter is for recessive, therefore we call these homozygous recessive. So this is a homozygous recessive genotype. A homozygous recessive genotype is a genotype that is made up of two exact recessive arrays. Now remember, we were talking about the types of genotypes that we have. We have a homozygous dominant. Homo means the same thing. So in a homozygous dominant is where you have in the homozygous genotype is where you have all the arrays making up a genotype are the same. It may be capital B, or it may be small letter b and small letter b. But apart from the homozygous genotype, we also have another type of genotypes, and this is called heterozygous. So in the heterozygous, you have two different arrays. In the homozygous, you have two exact arrays. You have the same arrays, whereas in the heterozygous, you have two different arrays. You may have capital B and small letter b, whereas in the homozygous you only have capital B and capital B, or you may have small letter b and small letter b. Remember that these letters, each of these letters is an array. When these arrays are combined, they form a genotype. A genotype is a pair of arrays. So we shouldn't forget that what are alleles? Alleles are different forms of the same gene, and we've said genes are the ones that are responsible for the development of characteristics in an individual. Any characteristic that a person shows is determined by what we call genes. And since alleles are genes, different forms of genes, it means they determine certain characteristics. So a genotype, we've said a genotype is a pair of alleles. So a genotype determines some characteristic in an individual. Each genotype determines characteristic in an individual. And these characteristics, these physical characteristics that we can see, but they are as a result of the genotype, is what we call a phenotype. So a phenotype we can say is the physical characteristic of an organism that is resulting from the influence of the genotype. For example, the genotype, let's have this genotype. Let's have capital T, and T should stand for tallness, and let's have small letter t, which should stand for dwarfism. So if a person has this genotype, a genotype that is made up of capital T and small letter t, and small letter t is for it's a recessive allele and is for shortness, we are very well aware that this person will be tall, because you have the dominant allele there. You have the capital T as the dominant allele. So we've said a dominant allele, it doesn't matter if it is combined with a recessive allele, the person only shows the characteristic determined by the dominant allele. So that is what is also happening here. So the capital T will determine the characteristic in the person, and the person will be tall. So we will be able to see that the person is tall. We cannot see the genotype, but we'll be able to see that the person is tall.